All right, you guys, I have been wanting to get this video out for so many months. Here it is. So this is some insight from my friend Beth, and she's talking about this awesome experience she had when doing family history that connected all of these people in history and connected some dots and answered some questions about some historical stories and experiences and events that tied in to her own family tree. So through her own family history work, she was able to sort of answer some questions and kind of solve some mysteries and tie that all in to her own ancestry, as well as make some connections to how all of this ties in to the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, I love her story because it really sort of motivates you to want to do your own family history so you can have these experiences. It really gets you to appreciate your own family tree and the people who came before you and sort of how they kind of give you those subtle little hints and reminders and nudges to do their work and to look into their stories. I love how she talks about how as she was sort of going down these rabbit holes and exploring, she would just have such a strong connection and feeling about certain individuals and certain experiences. And she couldn't understand why she was so drawn to them until later when all of this came together and made sense. And how when she came to that realization, it gave her goosebumps, or what I call spirit bumps. And what's even more awesome is my family tree ties into this story. And after she shared it with me, I told her that. I said, oh my goodness, I did some research earlier this year, and I have connections to someone you talk about in this story. So I'm going to save that little surprise for the end of the video. Without further ado, here is Insight with Beth.
Okay, this is kind of fun. William Shakespeare is a really fun topic to me. I thought that was really fun that you brought it up. So years ago, there was this show BYU TV put out about these kids. It was really good. It was a drama, but it was about these kids that I don't remember, but these kids in the town like set back in the 1960s, I believe, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was really good. So I was watching it, and they even had, like, Christopher Lloyd was in it, you know, the guy that played Doc in the Back to the Future movies, kind of with the crazy hair and everything, and he was, like, a teacher in there. Well, anyway, he was teaching these kids this class, and they were studying Shakespeare, and he really made a point to point out, was William Shakespeare, who was that? Was that really who it was, or was that his pen name? And he really pointed out, like, shake the spear. Shake the spear means, like, you write with your pen. And he was like, it was just like a clever nickname. And I was like, what? I have never heard this before. Are you kidding me? And I was like, BYU is teaching this on their show? What is this? So I went and I looked into it. And that took me down a whole rabbit hole that was absolutely fascinating. And what it concluded with, and if you're interested in any of this, I can go find it for you so you can look at the evidence and the things people have pulled up that's just so fascinating, is that William Shakespeare was really a conglomerate of a whole bunch of very well-educated men that had a lot of time on their hands, and they wanted to write plays, and they put it all together, and they were led by kind of a ringmaster of it, like a head guy, but they would basically meet together, and they would write these plays, and the different things that played out in their lives ended up going into the plays. So it's really fascinating. The person that they credit with William Shakespeare, like from that Von Avon place, that particular person was completely illiterate and like didn't finish school. He didn't know how to read and write. And they're like, so you're telling me this uneducated man that never knew how to read and write suddenly wrote like the great masterpieces of these, you know, masterful plays of the you know, that time period, and even till today? They're like, yeah, I don't think so. So anyway, there is a ton of evidence out there that was so, I mean, it was just honestly clear as day, like once you start looking at it, that Sir Francis Bacon was actually the head guy for this. And I didn't know much about him, so I started studying it. And okay, I didn't know why, but this topic fascinated me. And this time period I've come to understand why this fascinated me, and I'll get to that. It has to do with my family history. But anyway, Sir Francis Bacon, he was really well off, and he is very much rumored to be the son of Queen Elizabeth I. She had 2 sons. There's a ton of evidence as well that exists that she had a secret marriage with this guy. I can't remember his name, but there's like paintings of him, and he, like Sir Francis Bacon, totally resembles this guy. And so she had Sir Francis Bacon, and then she had another son, and both sons she ended up placing with families to raise, because she would lose her power if she wasn't known as the Virgin Queen. Like, that was extremely important, that she was not married so that she could keep the throne. And then, of course, like, she couldn't, if she was not married, then she couldn't be having marital relations. That would have not been appropriate for her to be queen. She was doing that. But there's lots out there of the secret wedding she had, and then these 2 children she ended up having, and she ended up placing with these families. So the Francis child she placed with the Bacon family. It's just so interesting, because there's a painting of Sir Francis Bacon. You can compare it with her painting and the alleged spouse of hers, the secret spouse, and he looks exactly like the dad. But then you compare it with his adoptive parents, and like, he looks nothing like them. Like, it's totally night and day difference, Anyway, it was fascinating going through the conversations, especially between Sir Francis Bacon and Queen Elizabeth I, that people in the court had overheard and recorded, and different things. And one of them was this argument they got into about her telling him he would never have the throne. And that anyway, it's really fascinating. It's so cool. Just this interesting information about that stuff. So anyway, it's really interesting, because there's a lot of different Shakespeare plays where there's this very like odd relationships between a prince and his mother in these different plays, and they figure it kind of stems from this relationship he had with her. So he was in the highest of high, like what do they call it? Like those secret societies, the masonry societies, those kind of things, whatever ones he was involved with. Anybody was involved with those. And this isn't like they were dark, secretive. In fact, they were usually used to like help men contribute time and talents to building up their societies in good ways. So anyway, he was highly involved with that, and a bunch of in the highest levels, and then a bunch of other very well-off, like gentrymen and courtiers and stuff, very well-educated men that were his buddies in that. They highly suspect were part of this writing group that would write these plays under the name of William Shakespeare. And Francis Bacon left all these clues behind, pointing to the fact that he was William Shakespeare. Like, he basically spelled it out, and in some of his plays he incorporated his and the other men's names, and they just loved being tricky with it, kind of thing, like dropping hints so that they knew and like thought it was so funny, but most people wouldn't catch on, kind of thing. Okay, so that was a really interesting rabbit hole of research years ago that I did, and I was always like, oh man, that is so crazy, and I never knew about the Sir Francis Bacon guy. Okay, fast forward to, it was in this house, because I remember in this house researching this. So I have an ancestor, his name is Caesar Adalmare. He was from Italy, and right around the time in Italy that Leonardo da Vinci lived in Italy. So it was right during the Renaissance, like big coming of age for Europe. And Caesar Adalmare went to university to become a doctor. And he ended up becoming very good in his practice. And he ended up being taken to England to become the head doctor for Queen Mary. And Queen Mary was, the sister of Queen Elizabeth. So, and this knowledge of the events and stuff just came over the years because I've always been fascinated with King Henry VIII and his 6 wives. I did research projects on some of the wives back in college, especially because they tie into my family, like his very last wife. Well, first off, his 3rd wife was my ancestor's sister, Jane Seymour. She was the sister of Henry Seymour, who is my ancestor. And Jane Seymour, her brother Thomas, and I think her other brother Edward. So Jane Seymour had the only son of Henry VIII, legitimate son. He had illegitimate sons, but this was the only legitimate one that could take the crown, right? But after King Henry VIII died, his son became king, and he was only about 10 years old, and he was only king for like a year or 2, and he just got sick and died, right? But during that time, his 2 uncles were his advisors that were trying to make sure he stayed in power, right? And his 2 uncles were his mother's uncles, his mother's brothers. And so that was my ancestor Henry, his oldest brothers, Thomas and Edward. And my ancestor took off for the countryside and took like whatever title his sister gave him while she was queen, like he was like justice of the peace or whatever. And he stayed out of all the dramas of court, which is how my line got preserved, because after his nephew, the king, died, I think it was Edward, I believe, King Edward, I could be wrong with that, but anyway, after that kid died, the 2 brothers, Thomas and Edward, ended up being beheaded by the next people that wanted to be in power. So anyway, there's a lot of connections with my Seymour family with King Henry VIII and all that. And again, I didn't know all this, but as a kid, I was fascinated by this family and just studied them. And in college, and I didn't discover the connections until I actually started researching this line, and it took me back to that, and I was blown away. Right. So anyway, King Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, I believe her name was, amazing individual. Like, I have so much respect and love for her. She was totally in love with Thomas Seymour, wanted to marry him, but then when the king took fancy to her and insisted he wanted to marry her, she didn't want to, because she was in love with Thomas Seymour. That was actually her age, right? But she said she prayed about it, and she felt the Spirit tell her she needed to marry the king, and it was part of her divine mission. And so she did, and she married King Henry VIII, and he was like this very old man by then, and he was almost bedridden. He was like so big and overweight and ill health, and he had bed sores, and she basically became his nursemaid. Like, she cared for him all the time and listened to his rants and was very kind and patient with him, which really helped calm him down in his late years, and he was kind of going crazy and all this stuff. But his daughter Elizabeth, she really took under her wing. Up until that time, Elizabeth had really been like cast off, and like kind of, like they even wanted to say she was illegitimate because she was Anne Boleyn's daughter, Anyway, Catherine Parr took Elizabeth under her wing, and she made sure that Elizabeth received an education and was just kind to her and treated her like a daughter. And I believe, this is the research paper I did back in college, I believe personally that Catherine, her divine mission, why she was told to marry the king, was for her influence that would be on Elizabeth, because nobody knew at that time Elizabeth would be the future queen, right? Everybody knew it was going to little Edward, and then after that would be Mary, and Elizabeth wasn't even considered legitimate. So anyway, her influence is what made Queen Elizabeth who she became. So it's really fascinating. Anyway, then after King Henry VIII died, Catherine was like 29. She was really young. And so she finally was freed to go marry her love. And Thomas had never married. He kind of waited for her. And so they were able to marry. And then 1 year later, she had their first child, and she died in childbirth. And so did the baby. So it's so sad. Like, it's such a sad tale, but also, like, very admirable, kind of amazing, like, the influence she had on one of the greatest monarchs the modern world, or I guess if that's not really modern, but of what led to the modern world of Queen Elizabeth. So anyway, that whole family's always kind of fascinated me, and the rise to power of Elizabeth. So first, after Edward died and there was like this grab for power, and that kind of went around for a while, eventually Mary got the power, the first daughter that came from the first wife. And she's the one that was known as Bloody Mary. But anyway, she tried to switch everything back to Catholic, so she was like killing off all the Protestants that she could, and it was just a crazy time. Well, anyway, she's the one that brought the Catholic Italian guy to come be her head doctor, and she had a really hard time getting pregnant. I learned this in a children's book years ago, and it was one of those things that tucked away in my mind. And so she got special doctors to help her figure out why she wasn't getting pregnant. She wanted to be pregnant so badly. She was convinced she was pregnant multiple times when she was not. I don't remember if she had a lot of miscarriages or what, but she just had a lot of trouble with it. So, yeah, my ancestor Caesar, I'm sorry, I'm getting excited about this, but I just remember it hitting me as I was reading this story about her and her doctors that she had to help her with this barrenness that she was dealing with. Like, I just remember it hitting me when I was reading this book. That is your ancestor it's talking about. He was helping her, trying to help her with getting pregnant. He was aware of this stuff. And if she hired and brought in a doctor all the way from Italy specifically to help her with her things she was struggling with, this is telling you what she was struggling with. It was infertility. So anyway, okay, so that's part of the clue that led to what I found this past year on this family. So when Mary died, I believe she was killed, and Elizabeth took power. Caesar Adalmari transferred and became Elizabeth's doctor. And so he was her head doctor until, I can't remember, I think he passed away before she did. So anyway, for the remainder of his life, right? And then he had a couple sons. One was named Julius, one was named Thomas. And this is funny. When Caesar died, Elizabeth wanted to honor him. So she changed the last name of she made it a decree that his son should take his first name as their last name to honor him and always remember him. So the family name changed to Caesar instead of Adalmari. So it is quite funny because one son he named Julius, so it became Julius Caesar, and the other Thomas Caesar. Julius Caesar became the Prime Minister of England and was a very good one, by the way, from what I read. He was very well known for being honest and just, and was very, very admired. There's still actually a lot of books I found about him today. But Thomas is my ancestor, and Thomas was just a well-off kid who was raised in the courts of Queen Elizabeth, and his brother was the prime minister, and he had various jobs that he was given, like a judge and different things, but he's not near as famous as his brother and his father and all this stuff. Okay, this is why I'm telling you these details. I'm sorry, this is I hope your eyes are not glazing over, but these are why these details are interesting, because this past year I found a book that had more information on Caesar Adalmari, the doctor. So I started reading it, and it really dove into some really good details on his life I had not gotten in any other books. And this was a biography written back in 17 or 1800s, somewhere in there. So you got to remember, this all started in the 1500s, because it's Renaissance time period. Leonardo da Vinci, Elizabeth, all those people. That time period. Okay, here's what caught my attention. So then I learned, okay, Elizabeth did have children. She had 2 children, right? And then it occurred to me, who was Elizabeth's doctor when she had children? It was my ancestor. It was Caesar. And not only that, I learned years ago, Caesar was specifically brought in because the Queen, Mary, was having infertility issues. So not only was he a doctor, but he seemed to specialize in being a women's doctor. He wouldn't have directly delivered babies. That would have been a midwife, right? Even back then. But he was checking these women. He would have known the queen was pregnant. He would have been sworn to secrecy with that. Here's where it gets interesting to me. Two things that just like blew up in my mind that Caesar knew Elizabeth was pregnant. One, his son Thomas, my ancestor, Thomas Caesar, became best friends with Sir Francis Bacon. They were absolute best friends, to the point where when Sir Francis Bacon died, Thomas Caesar was at his side, not only at his side, but he was holding him in an embrace as Francis died in his bed. They were absolute best friends. And I thought, boy, isn't that just a small world? Sir Francis Bacon is rumored to be the son of Elizabeth I. My ancestor, Thomas's father, was Elizabeth's doctor. He would have very much known about her pregnancy. He would have very much known about her secret baby placed for adoption. Isn't that so very funny that his son that was raised in the courts just happened to be best friends with that supposed son of Elizabeth I? I thought that was pretty interesting. The second thing I thought was interesting, especially as time went on with Elizabeth and she had many threats, is she's another person I have been absolutely fascinated with since I was a kid and have never known why. But I even remember coming across this children's picture book of her when I was 10 years old, and I remember my class was ready to leave the library. I couldn't put this book down about her. I was just fascinated by it. And I remember at the end it said, and some people think she actually secretly married to this guy. She wasn't actually the Virgin Queen. She just had to say that to maintain her power. And that was planted in my head when I was 10 years old. And I think for a reason. So anyway, as I studied her life, she became very, very paranoid the throne would be taken from her. I mean, for good reason. She'd seen people killed over the throne. She'd had quite the battle to obtain the throne herself. Not only that, she felt a very divine mission to keep the throne because she had seen the bloody mess that her sister had made trying to make the country go back Catholic. And she really felt it was her divine mission to keep the country Protestant and not go back to Catholicism, which is very, very interesting because if she had not done that, we probably would have led to the Restoration and all that stuff. I mean, possibly, but it was a key role that she kept England Protestant for the Restoration to happen. So anyway, she started getting really paranoid about who could take away her throne, right? And if there was a threat to her throne, she would usually jail the person. So she had cousins and people who had been best friends with her as kids. She just started jailing them, right? And imprisoning them and all this stuff. Well, one of the people she imprisoned was my ancestor, Caesar Adelmare. And I had never heard this information before coming across this biography this past year. She put him under house arrest in London. And people are like, we have no idea why. Did he upset her? What happened? He seemed to still be a good guy. He was never charged with anything. She just put him under house arrest. And for the rest of his life, until he died, he was not allowed to leave his house. And then when he did die, she honored the family by passing on his name and made this big deal about it. So they're like, what on earth happened? And in that moment, it was just pure clarity came to my mind. And it was one of those things where it's I was just covered in goosebumps and I felt the spirit. And I was because he knew she was not the Virgin Queen. He knew she had children. He had direct knowledge of that. And that was a threat to her throne. That was a threat to her crown. And she knew if that information got out, her crown would be taken away. She wouldn't be considered legitimate to be queen, and the throne would be under threat of being taken over by a Catholic again. So anyway, it just made it so clear in my mind that is what happened. I don't know if maybe he was getting older and his tongue was getting a little looser, or he was, maybe rattled on and might slip or something. She was afraid he might slip and share that information. But anyway, so he was under house arrest, never charged with anything, honored at his death, but she didn't want him talking about something that was a threat. And his son was best friends with her alleged biological son. who also has a ton of evidence that he led the William Shakespeare writing brigade with a group of his best friends, which is really interesting because one of his best friends was my ancestor, Thomas Caesar. So I have just always wondered if Thomas Caesar had a role in some of those Shakespeare plays. Anyway, that is my interesting thought about William Shakespeare and some possible, I guess, alternative history than what's presented out there. But I do think it's really fascinating, and I think it's really interesting. And it's one of those things where, like, I look forward to asking my ancestors about one day when I get to meet them, because it was such a moment of clarity when that came. Like, it just like made more sense to me why this Queen Elizabeth and King Henry VIII and his wives, like, why they've always fascinated me since I was a child. And I came to realize how closely linked my family was to this crazy royal family. Like, very intricately linked with them. And I don't know, it has been my experience over and over researching for different people's families that they want their stories to be known, and they find ways to help you discover those, you know. So anyway, there's really a lot that went into maintaining England as a Protestant place, which is also very fascinating to me. I've looked into some other theories people have had of who William Shakespeare was, some other different people he could be, or different things, and I've never seen something have the amount of evidence that the Sir Francis Bacon theory has. That one, I mean, it's just like, I just remember looking like flat out at his handwriting and the things he wrote and the different names he used in the plays, and I'm like, is all points to him. I mean, it's just like clear as like day. I was right there. So anyway. Oh, the other thing that stood out to me with that topic is that one of the plays, you know, that William Shakespeare wrote was Julius Caesar, right? And that whole play with Tu Brute, and I remember I had to memorize a bunch of that back in high school. Anyway, Thomas Caesar, but his brother Julius Caesar that became prime minister, they were part of Francis Bacon's, like, Masonic brotherhood, as I mentioned. Anyway, I just think that's so funny. Like, I don't know, that whole Julius Caesar connection, like, he actually had a friend named Julius Caesar, and their father, Caesar Adamare, he had that name, the first name of Caesar, because he was from the Caesari family. His mother was of noble royal birth, and she had the last name of Caesari, or of the Caesar family. So anyway, I haven't traced our Caesar line back enough to know, like, which Caesars they were connected to, right? But I know that it was, like, really important to these families to show their connection to these big Roman heroes from back in the day or whatever. So anyway, I just think it's really interesting. I wonder if they did have connections back to Julius Caesar, considering they named one of the children that. And then one of his BFFs writes a play called Julius Caesar with the help of his friends. And I just can't help but wonder if it was, like, influenced by the Adamari brothers that were going by the last name of Caesar. So anyway, just kind of another funny note. And you can Google like Francis Bacon, Thomas Caesar, and see stuff about these Caesar brothers coming up with him. And you can also Google Francis Bacon and Queen Elizabeth. Sir Richard Dudley is who people think was his father, the, like, adoptive father, whose name was Nicholas Bacon. He was head of the seal of the Queen. So, like, he actually worked with the Queen and was, like, directly, like, under her command, and a very trusted advisor of hers. There's just a lot of little links that are just really funny between all these people. And anyway, it's just kind of interesting. But when I was Googling it just now, one of the things it mentioned is they found further evidence that Francis Bacon ended up faking his death with the help of his Masonic brotherhood. brethren and the brotherhood. And then he went and lived out the rest of his days in Europe because the Duke of Buckingham actually was trying to knock him off and kill him. Again, there was like power placed for the throne, and King James, who inherited the kingdom after the Queen Elizabeth I died, he was a cousin, and he was a good friend of Sir Francis Bacon, but at the same time, anyway, I won't get into it. There was just a lot going on, but like he had a mark on his head. People were trying to knock him off, and so anyway, I guess there's some stuff coming out that they think he faked his death, and there's actually multiple letters people wrote him after, and he did some revisions to some Shakespeare works, like where he wanted some further editing done, and just these different things that have given them cause to believe that. Anyway, I just think that's funny that they're like, yeah, his brotherhood helped fake this death and like really put out there, and they made this big deal that he had passed because he was a huge celebrity in his day, right? Anyway, I just think that's funny because that was in our family history books that Thomas, like, yes, Thomas held him as he took his last breaths. Thomas was there by his side, childhood friends. Well, Thomas was one of his Masonic brothers. So anyway, I'm like, so maybe he played that part in helping fake, that death and stuff. So anyway, history is funny what gets reported and what gets passed down as tradition, and then just accepted as truth in the history books without a lot of evidence or people questioning it when evidence doesn't really add up. So it's really interesting to me to sometimes learn about things that really happened, how things like the dynamics that really were going on. So anyway, this is probably more interesting to me than anybody else, but thought I'd share. Hope you enjoy.
Okay, are you ready to hear my connection into this family tree or into the story? So here is a screenshot of my family tree. This is on my great-grandfather's side of the family. Now, what's interesting is I may have shared his story before in a past video, but he was an orphan, and for decades and decades, nobody knew the origins of where he came from. Nobody knew who his parents were or anything about his story. My first experience with genealogy, with doing family history, when my oldest son was born, this was my first experience, was cracking the mystery and breaking through that brick wall, which my great aunt had spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars paying history detectives to figure this out, and over the decades they couldn't solve it. And here I was with no experience whatsoever, and I was able to follow the promptings of the Spirit and break through this brick wall in our family tree, which led us to all this amazing heritage. We could see that his line went all the way back to royalty, and not only that, but his side of the tree also is connected to Joseph Smith's tree. There are a lot of amazing people in that tree, in his line, and I could see how the adversary wanted to hide that part of the tree. The adversary didn't want him or his posterity to know where they come from, to know who they really are. And you can see down the line in his tree, his children, their children, they all sort of lost their identity of who they are. There was a lot of sadness and depression, and many people who left the church in that posterity. And so I feel that the adversary really targeted that line and didn't want the descendants to know who they really are and where they come from. So this was pretty exciting when I cracked through that brick wall to find out who this side of the tree, who they really are and where they come from. And it was actually pretty healing. So let's get into it. Here it is, right here. I've got it circled. We're talking about Richard Neville and his son, Sir Thomas Neville. Yes, they are the famous House of Neville, and they are the builders of this right here, Raby Castle in Durham, England. Yes, this is on my bucket list. In fact, England is on my bucket list. Hopefully someday I'll make it there. My in-laws are from Germany, so any chance we get to go to that side of the world, it's to see my in-laws. It's to go to Germany. So someday I would love to go to England. So, Richard Neville is the 5th Earl of Salisbury. He was an English nobleman and magnate based in northern England who became a key supporter of the House of York during the early years of the War of the Roses. He was the father of Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, who was known as the Kingmaker. So what exactly is a kingmaker? These are people of significant influence to a king. So they would be like their advisors, whether it's political or religious. These are people who are experts and advise the king, but they are not in a position themselves to be a king. And it's said that the term kingmaker was coined from my ancestor, Richard Neville. So these are my great grandfathers. Lots of greats, because they were great. So Richard and his wife, Alice Montacute, they had 12 children. And so here's a list of their sons. I circled the one who I am related to, Sir Thomas Neville, and he was knighted in 1449 and he died at the Battle of Wakefield. And I'm going to tell you about his sister. So, Richard had 6 sons and 6 daughters, and one of his sons was my ancestor, Thomas, and one of his daughters was Alice. Alice Neville. Let me tell you who she was and how she ties into the story. So Alice married Henry Fitzhugh, who was the 5th Baron, and they had a daughter named Elizabeth, who married William Parr. And they had a child who was Catherine Parr. Yes, this Catherine Parr right here in our story, who was the 6th wife of King Henry VIII. So my great, however many great aunts, she was the great-grandmother of Catherine Parr, making Catherine one of my cousins. And Richard Neville, my great, however many great grandfather, was the grandson of King Edward III of England. Now, this was through King Edward's mistress, who later became his wife. Her name was Catherine Swynford. So I am a descendant of King Henry III, and many of my ancestors through this line rubbed shoulders with these kings and with these leaders of England. They were very involved in the War of the Roses, and they were advisors in the royal courts. The Neville coat of arms is a white cross on a red shield. So this is very connected to the flag of England, which is St. George's Cross. So that's interesting, but what's even more interesting is if you look at the family tree, you can see that the male surname was actually Fitz. So you have Fitz-Dolphin and then Fitz-Maldred, and Fitz-Maldred, Robert Fitz-Maldred, married Isabel de Neville. So he married Isabel of Neville and took on that name, and that's where the name changed in the family tree to Neville. Now, the Fitz-Maldreds, their shield was a white chevron on a red background, and this signifies protection, which also the white cross on the red background symbolizes protection. And this crest also has a griffin on it, and the griffin symbolizes military strength, courage, and leadership. And I thought this was interesting. The name Fitz-Maldred comes from its first bearer, who was a person noted for giving good counsel, which makes sense as to why all of their descendants were advisors and counselors in the royal courts. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story, and I hope that it inspired you to want to spend some time exploring your own family tree. I'd love to hear what stories you discover. Reach out to me anytime. Thanks so much, and hope you guys have a great week.